everyone, and welcome back to another video. We're talking about the OnePlus 9 Pro, and this was a smartphone that was surrounded by all kinds of hype on social media prior to its official release. And even when it was officially released, it essentially had no secrets to hide, mainly because of how much information was leaked online prior to it dropping. And I'm not talking unofficial leaks or anything. OnePlus's official Twitter account basically gave us everything we needed to know about this phone prior to it dropping. I mean, outside of the price, obviously. Now, the big story with this particular lineup this year is OnePlus's partnership with the legendary camera maker Hasselblad in an attempt to raise the smartphone camera experience up to flagship levels of quality. So you and I are going to spend some time deep diving into the OnePlus 9 Pro to see if this particular phone lived up to all of that pre-release hype. Let's do this. Oddly enough, one point of pretty popular debate seems to be around the color of the 9 Pro, specifically the morning mist color that my unit also happens to be in. It's really polarized a lot of buyers of the phone and even tech reviewers alike, in that some people seem to really like the color and others seem to really hate the color. I never thought I would start a review by talking about a flagship phone's color, but I happen to lean more towards the side of actually liking the morning mist color. I think it's dope. And out of the two that the OnePlus 9 Pro is currently available in, either morning mist or pine green, I thought the morning mist was a relatively easy choice. Now keep in mind, this is super shiny Gorilla Glass, so if you're like me and you don't like to put any of your phones in a case, it will collect fingerprints and smudges relatively quickly. Now, it is a flagship phone with a glass back, so yes, you do have access to wireless charging. And if you have a compatible wireless warp charger from OnePlus, this phone is capable of charging wirelessly at a massive 50 watts. That is wild. We'll get back to battery and charging here in a minute, but I gotta say, I'm actually a really big fan of just how well built the OnePlus 9 Pro is and how nice it feels in the hand. It actually reminds me a lot of the Galaxy S20, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. I happen to really like both how that phone looked and how it felt in hand. The OnePlus 9 Pro is curved around its edges, which makes it really ergonomic, and given that this phone is relatively large, even by my standards, it's not unwieldy like certain phones that also come in at this size, like an iPhone 12 Pro Max, let's say. And of course, this is a OnePlus phone and they're sticking true to their roots, so the 9 Pro is an absolute spec monster on paper. Snapdragon 888, 12 gigs of RAM, and 256 gigs of storage. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time talking to you about performance because I'm sure you can come to the reasonable conclusion that top-end internals from Qualcomm mixed with Oxygen OS 11 based on Android 11 is going to be super fast. The phone can handle anything you throw at it and more from a performance standpoint. I will spend some time talking about Oxygen OS because OnePlus has steadily evolved Oxygen OS over the last couple of years, and it's now gotten to a point where it really does resemble Samsung's One UI in terms of look, feel, and even feature set. All of those awesome settings that OnePlus added to the 8 Pro are now here, but there's now additional settings that you can find. So for those of you that really like to customize your phone from a setting and software perspective, the 9 Pro will make you happy. It's definitely not the Oxygen OS that we knew from 2 or 3 years ago, but if I had to choose between Oxygen OS and One UI, I'm still taking what OnePlus has to offer, even though it's not as clean as what we saw from a couple of years ago. One thing I did want to mention, software updates. OnePlus is obviously expanding and growing as a company. And when it comes to expanding your product line, sometimes software updates, especially from a monthly security patch standpoint, can take a little bit of a back seat. Think about it this way. OnePlus has to get the Android source from Google, tailor it to their Oxygen OS spin of Android, and then make that update applicable for the X amount of phones that are able to actually receive Android 11 software updates. So from a 9 Pro perspective, I've received 2 software updates out of the box, which is actually not out of the ordinary considering the phone just recently launched. But if we go back to last year's flagship phone, the 8 Pro, which I actually had up until just a few days ago, that phone was on the December security patch up until like late February or early March, which is definitely longer than what I would expect from a company like OnePlus, who definitely values their software experience. So it's going to be really interesting to see how the 9 Pro ages from a software update standpoint as well. I did mention that this is a big phone, and it really is. It comes clocking in with a 6.7-inch Quad HD LTPO 120 Hz display. All of that basically means that from a display quality perspective, it's excellent. And I was expecting nothing less. Every OnePlus flagship phone in recent memory has come with an incredible display, and the 9 Pro definitely continues that trend. A couple of things I want to point out though. The curves on the edges of the display are not as extreme as they were on the 8 Pro. It's not completely flat, but it's also not as dramatic at the end to the point where you're going to have accidental touches if you are, let's say, playing a game on the phone. I had no issues with accidental touches on the 9 Pro, so that's great. One thing though, the fingerprint sensor location is different this year around, which is kind of odd considering I feel like it's been relatively consistent in terms of location on the 8 Pro, and 8T from last year. This year around, it's a lot lower and closer to the bottom bezel, which I think is strange. I have relatively large hands, and the 9 Pro feels comfortable in my hand, but even with that, when I go to unlock the phone with my thumb, if I'm not holding it with 2 hands, I gotta do that kind of one-handed shimmy to get my thumb in the right location to unlock it. It's not a deal breaker by any means, but it's just strange to see how much it's changed over the course of just 1 year. Now, the game changer for this year's display is the utilization of LTPO technology. LTPO stands for low temperature polycrystalline oxide, and what it allows OnePlus to do is dynamically adjust the refresh rate based on what type of content is on the display. In the case of the 9 Pro, it can scale anywhere between 1 Hz to 120 Hz, which is dope. Now, OnePlus did a really good job of incorporating some neat software tricks to take advantage of this, and one obvious place to find it is in the always on display settings. Always on display is not new for OnePlus, but what is new is, let's say you set a clock as your always on display, you can now have an animated seconds hand that actually moves even with the display not being on. Normally something like this would drain a little more battery, but LTPO technology allows for that refresh rate without taking a major hit on battery life. And even with all that cool tech to help save battery life, I actually found the battery life on the 9 Pro to be relatively average considering it's packing a 4,500 milliamp hour cell. I'm not saying it's bad by any means. It can definitely get you through 1 full day of heavy usage, but chances are, depending on what you were doing, you may need to top up your phone at the end of the night. I think I was just kind of spoiled by the Galaxy S21 Ultra's almost 2-day battery life, but where I gotta give OnePlus some credit is you actually get a charger in the box. And speaking of chargers, your charging options on the 9 Pro are wild, regardless of which way you go. It's capable of 50-watt wireless charging, as long as you have a compatible OnePlus Warp wireless charger, or you can just use the brick that's in the box, because that's capable of charging it at 65 watts. Now, if you're having flashbacks or some PTSD from the Galaxy Note 7 days, you're not alone. I felt the same way, but OnePlus is able to safely pull off these charging speeds by incorporating that neat trick they used on the 8T. And that's instead of using one giant cell, they've split the cell into 2. And those 2 individual batteries receive a divided current to the both of them. So they're able to safely charge the phone incredibly fast. Now, the part we've all been waiting for, myself included, because let me tell you, this was hyped up a lot all over social media. And that is the performance of the new camera system in partnership with Hasselblad. Now, let's get the specs out of the way because I just want to jump into the details and show you some photos. You're looking at a 48 megapixel wide angle, a 50 megapixel ultra wide angle, 8 megapixel telephoto, and a 2 megapixel depth sensor. Now, I mentioned it in our event recap video, but I'm not really sure how much input Hasselblad had when it comes to hardware, because all the hardware for this system is sourced from Sony. But what I can say is the OnePlus 9 Pro takes some incredibly color accurate photos, and they're also really detailed. And I can pretty confidently say that Hasselblad had a large part to do with that. So if you were to take photos from the 9 Pro and put them up next to, let's say, photos that are taken on an S21 Ultra, they may appear washed out, but that's not necessarily the case. I honestly felt like photos reproduced by the 9 Pro were both color accurate, color detailed, and image detail itself was there, which is not necessarily something we've seen from previous OnePlus phones. I feel like the initial partnership with Hasselblad has definitely helped boost this camera system to that flagship territory. And again, they're not even providing much input from a hardware perspective. Now I gotta say, in terms of images themselves, the 9 Pro produces what I feel like your eyes see, but not necessarily what your eyes want to see, if that makes sense. It reproduces basically what you're looking at, but it may not necessarily reproduce the type of image that you think to yourself, I should upload this to Instagram. I understand that not a lot of people out there are fortunate enough to use smartphones from almost every brand throughout the year, every time they drop. But I gotta say, if I only owned a OnePlus 9 Pro, I would feel super confident in the camera system on this phone to the point where I wouldn't worry about owning any other type of smartphone whenever it comes to camera performance. And that's not something that I've really been able to say about OnePlus phones in the past. A cool new video feature that OnePlus was touting this year is the phone's ability to record in 4K at 120 frames per second. I tested this out and it's pretty cool, especially if you're able to upload that video to a computer and then kind of render it in slow-mo, which is what 120 frames per second is going to be really good for. But given the fact that it's producing really large video sizes and the rendering that's required behind these videos can also take some time and be relatively heavy, I don't see recording in 120 frames as practical for everyday use. The good thing is that you have a plethora of other recording options like 1080p at 30 and 60, 4K at 30 and 60, and even 8K at 30 frames per second. So 120 frames per second is cool, just I don't think we're quite there yet. All in all, I gotta say, the OnePlus 9 Pro is an excellent flagship smartphone, and when you consider its competitive price point, $1,069, it's actually really well priced in my opinion, given the feature set. And again, this is a OnePlus flagship phone that we can now look at and think to ourselves, it doesn't really have a fatal flaw or an Achilles heel where you can buy X smartphone that's going to be significantly better than the 9 Pro in this particular category. And considering the phones that it's directly competing against, like the iPhone 12 Pro, 12 Pro Max, and the Galaxy S21 Ultra, it undercuts basically every single one of those phones. And it also comes with a super complete feature set now that OnePlus has rounded out that camera experience. So all in all, great phone. If you're on the market for a new Android phone, you should definitely consider this. Or if you're looking to upgrade an older OnePlus phone, this is a really, really solid upgrade. As always, if you guys enjoyed the review, make sure you hit like and subscribe. And we're in the process of filming the review for this phone's little brother, the OnePlus 9. So if you're excited to see that review, definitely make sure you subscribe so you're notified as soon as that review goes live as well. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace. All in all, I gotta say, the OnePlus 9 Pro is an excellent flagship phone provided by OnePlus, and when can you do that?